Hi, friends, and good evening to you. We are back again here on Moonshot Conversations. And today's topic is something which is very, very interesting, the power of forgiveness. So, Lina, our conversations on empathy were just fabulous, and the Corroboree loved it. Now, from empathy to forgiveness.
So, good evening, Agnala Rajesh, and absolutely from empathy to forgiveness, because there is absolutely a real connection between the two. Although,
Yes.
there's considerable debate about the definitions of forgiveness and whether forgiveness should always be given or only given if certain, boxes are ticked off. For example, does the perpetrator feel remorse? But nevertheless, there's this general similarity in the process of forgiveness. So,
Mhm.
one of the key steps in all models of forgiveness is empathy. For any victim to be able to forgive, he or she must be able to develop empathy towards the perpetrator as one of the necessary steps. So, according to models of forgiveness, individuals with higher levels of the empathy trait will find it easier to work towards forgiveness than those with lower levels of empathy. And there's some individuals incapable of empathy, they will find it very, very difficult to forgive.
Loved that, Lina. I liked it when you said that individuals with higher levels of the trait of empathy find it easier to work towards forgiveness. So, people who develop the empathy muscle are more likely to be the people who find it easier to forgive, Lina.
Absolutely. So scientists have studied what happens in the brain when we
Mhm.
think about forgiving someone. And what they've discovered is that, even when people are just imagining forgiving someone, so this is not even a real situation, it's a hypothetical situation. Even in that situation, they show increased activity in the neural circuits responsible for empathy. So this tells us that empathy is connected to forgiveness and is an absolutely important step in the whole process of forgiveness.
Lina, when we spoke about empathy, you spoke about the fact that most adults who go out in the world to harm others have themselves been victims of intense trauma as children. It has really got me thinking. I have thought back to people who I feel go out intentionally harming others and have managed to see more clearly that they too carry wounds. Lina, I've also found the capacity to think back to their childhood and see them as innocent children. I went back to look at criminals and to look at their entire life narrative from early childhood throughout to their adulthood. Lina, I now understand the psychological suffering and how the wounded gets out to wound. Today, I don't see, one side of the narrative. I see both sides.
So, yeah, there's studies done on intergenerational trauma. That's trauma that goes through generations, which means a parent who suffered trauma as a child will in turn affect the development of their own child. So then that child in turn will affect the, next generation, and this intergenerational trauma cycle continues. But here's the really scary thing, that trauma is actually encoded into the DNA of the subsequent generations. So, in some sense, we keep increasing the levels of trauma in the world until somebody in that family awakens and to begin healing for themselves. And then when they start healing themselves, they absolutely start healing subsequent generations. So, I will also tell you about something called Hoponopono, which is a Hawaiian ritual to heal intergenerational trauma through the power of forgiveness.
So this has to have huge implications not only for a child who suffers from physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, but also for children who suffer the trauma of war.
Yes, and there's so much research being done to understand this, from a genetic, neural, and cognitive basis. Imagine the fact that we pass on our experience of stress and trauma, and when we do, the children that inherit it, are likely to be more fearful and even more aggressive than other children. You know, that due to an evolutionary process that exists so that organisms, um, can adapt to their environment, these children who are born with trauma based DNA have a compromised starting point compared to other children. So they almost that their starting point is way behind that of other children. Now, when you view this with empathy, will it not impact your likeliness of forgiving the child who bullies other children on the playground?
So I absolutely agree to what you said, Lina. There is so much pain in the world, but the good news is it can be healed. Just imagine a world without forgiveness. We could be building a perpetual cycle of suffering.
Absolutely. It's interesting. The Dalai Lama's biggest fear, after serving 18 years in a Chinese prison, the thing that he was most scared of losing was his compassion for the Chinese. We need more individuals like His Holiness in the world. Human history is built upon war and bloodshed. To build a peaceful future, we must all learn forgiveness. And like every concept we have discussed, like giving, empathy, and contribution, forgiveness does not only benefit the guilty or the perpetrator, it also relieves the person being asked to forgive. Holding on to resentment, anger, and hate only keeps people emotionally trapped.
Absolutely, Lina. After serving 18 years in a Chinese prison, the thing that the Dalai Lama was most fearful was losing his compassion for the Chinese. This statement absolutely teaches a lot. Lina, what is the actual definition of forgiveness?
So forgiveness, a definition is it's an individual, voluntary, internal process, of letting go of feelings and thoughts, of resentment, bitterness, anger, and letting go of the need for revenge and retribution towards someone we believe has, done something wrong to us. Although forgiveness has been an important concept in almost all religious and spiritual practices, it is only fairly recently that it has become an object of psychological research. Over time, forgiveness practice has been included as a part of the treatment of trauma. Research in positive psychology has found that the outcomes of forgiveness are very many good ones. It's a reduction in negative thinking, anxiety and depression, and an increase in positive thinking, hope, and self-esteem.
So, Lina, why would we wrong or want to hurt ourselves?
So when we hurt others intentionally, we actually also really hurt ourselves. Anytime you think or act in a certain way and you feel guilt, this is when we're receiving information that our thoughts, actions, or behaviors conflict with our values and beliefs. That's when you get that twinge of guilt. You need to then forgive yourself and heal from the mistake you made. Here I want to sort of make a distinction between guilt and shame, because
Mhm.
shame serves no purpose and it makes it more difficult to heal. So guilt is when you get, you get that your action was wrong. Shame is you believe that your whole self is wrong and not the specific act or behavior.
Every human being alive has at some point made a mistake or hurt someone else intentionally or unintentionally. So I can see how we need to learn self forgiveness.
Absolutely. I mean, I know I have, unintentionally and intentionally hurt someone else. The first step, was to admit that I messed up. The trick in that moment is to let go of regret. Things you should have done but did not. Times you should have spoken up but did not. Times you should have started but did not. Because regret is not helpful to you now or in the future. So until you forgive yourself for your past, you actually remain a prisoner of it.
So you owned your mistake, Lina?
Absolutely. Too often, we use denial as a way to protect ourselves from the negative emotions of guilt and shame. But denial or ignoring, any situation never helps. It only actually delays the healing process. It is better to understand exactly what you did wrong, why you made the mistake, practice self empathy and compassion, and do whatever you can to repair the situation, including apologizing. Now, once this is all over, now you need to start seeing this as a part of your evolution towards becoming a better person.
And hope that whoever you have apologized to, Lina, is watching this episode on forgiveness. Lina, earlier you had said that some people have the view that forgiveness is not something that has to happen if certain boxes are not ticked off. I mean, should someone who has really suffered, like a victim of abuse, terror, or war, really supposed to be the one doing the work of forgiveness? What if the perpetrator had no remorse, was not sorry for the pain caused? Would that not seem unfair to some people, Ina?
Well, the reality is that the act of forgiveness is not necessarily to ease the mental or emotional state of a perpetrator. The act of forgiveness is to release your own emotional states, or of feeling stuck, of being a victim. When we hold a grudge or we don't forgive, we do not release what is holding us back, and then this kind of controls our life and can also make us sick. I spoke about Louis Medes, who so wisely said, to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. So when one withholds forgiveness, you keep your own hurt, anger, and blame alive, and this will discolor, one's perception of life.
I agree to Lewis when he says to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. Lena, is there a formula or process one can follow on the path that one takes forward to forgiveness?
So there are many steps, and here is, one process I read that's got 5 steps, and that can expand our capacity to forgive. So the first step is to surrender, what you cannot control. This effectively means that we make a clear choice to accept what is outside of our control. This is relinquishing our need to be right or to be justified in our anger or our bitterness. And this is a very courageous act to take, and sometimes this is all it truly takes to truly forgive. Step 2 is to expand your empathy. So now we look at the situation from the other person's viewpoint and begin asking ourselves, why would that person behave the way he or she did? If you had the same set of experiences, could you possibly have acted the same way?
So, Lina, we have got our corroboree joining us. There is Vinita Melwani, Sangeeta Pardesi, Sulakshan Kumar, Sandeep Pote, Paul Ritesh. There is Divya Punjabi, Jaya Parekh, all joining us. There is Nainas also, who has commented, agree, forgiving others is not for others. It is for your own mental peace. There is an interesting comment from Paul Ritesh, who says, forgiveness is good for soul. Always have a forgiving nature. There is a question from Divya Punjabi, which has already been answered by you. What is the difference between shame and guilt? Jaya Parekh has a comment where she says, to hold on to anger is like holding a hot piece of coal in your hand and expecting the other person to get burned. Fantastic. To the point. So, Lina, I can now see why empathy as a skill is essential for forgiveness. We often have to forgive others. What about forgiveness of oneself?
In both cases, Agnel Rajesh, somebody else or yourself, you do yourself an injustice if you don't forgive. In both cases, your life will only improve once you commit, the practice of forgiveness. Empathy is not only for others; it is also for yourself.
Fantastic, Lina. So step 1 is to surrender what you cannot control. Step 2 is to expand your empathy. That's understood. Now, what is step 3?
So step 3 is to release the past. In order to move forward in our lives, we must release the past. Unknowingly, we often carry, the past with us. And if we are not mindful, we, and if we don't live in the present moment, we will always feel stuck because we're weighed down with the baggage of the past. Without a regular practice of releasing, we store these unprocessed emotions in our bodies and in our minds. My dad is watching, and he was holding on to anger against his cousin brother, and he knows that the minute he forgave, he actually released a whole lot. So one of the great things is journaling. It's a great way to release the past. When you write things down, you release them onto paper. A lot of people then burn that paper. Step 4 is to take your power back. No one has the power to make you feel uneasy without your permission.
Yes.
So start writing a new story for yourself. This will mean reminding yourself that you are choosing to forgive. And you can choose an affirmation and write it down and pin it somewhere where you'll see it frequently.
What would an affirmation for forgiveness look like, Lina? Can you share an example?
So it'll go like, today, I choose to be happy and free. I choose to take my power back. Today, I choose to release old emotions and memories. Today, I forgive. And in doing so, I move forward with joy and with peace.
Why do some people find it easier to forgive than others, Lina?
So the willingness to forgive comes from deep within. One is if you've got increased empathy, you'll find it easier to forgive. But also if we have mastered love of the self, and believe we are worthy of living happy, loving, and purposeful lives, we will find it easier to forgive than those that have not mastered love of the self.
Lovely. That is so awesome, Lina. Step one is surrender what you can't control. Step two is putting yourself in the shoes of the other, the practice of empathy. Step three is to release the past, and step four is to take your power back. Now, what would be step five, Lina?
So step 5 is to embrace the lesson. Each experience we have is a learning opportunity. I have often recanted my experiences of 2006, but it's not only in my need to forgive others, but I also at the time caused hurt to others and had to ask them for forgiveness, as well as go through the process of forgiving myself. But it is going through that experience that has got me to where I am and who I am today. I'm definitely stronger and wiser for it. It is through challenging experiences that we grow and transform. When we embrace the lesson that forgiveness has for us, we cannot help but embrace peace, gratitude, and love.
Awesome, Lina. So I have asked you the question of why some people find forgiveness easy and some find it very challenging. Uh, there is another question, Lina, that wouldn't some people be easier to forgive and others not so much based on the seriousness and the severity of the pain that they inflict? I mean, someone who steals has to be easier to forgive than someone who takes the life of another human being, for instance.
Absolutely, Agnel Rajesh. But the first thing we must consider is that people are always acting and reacting from their own injury. So how deep is their injury? And they come from that, not really from the desire to do us harm. The bully on the playground is trying to gain a feeling of control because in his life or her life at home, there's a lack of a sense of control. In all these years of working with children, the common reasons that children bully, other children at school or anywhere else is a lack of attention or neglect. So the bullying is a lash out for attention. Or another case could be that an older sibling or a parent also could be bullying the child. So now he or she is trying to feel more in control by taking back some power. So we all respond to life from the information and experiences we have, and that's all these kids are doing.
Fantastic. I think you've also answered Vinita Melvani's interesting question where she's saying, but Lina, there are times when you can't forgive someone who has hurt you, and it's very difficult to forgive them. You just can't forget what they have done to you and put you through. Then what does one do? So I think your answer covered that question as well. Would you like to add something more to that, Lina?
No, Vinita, I'm just going to say you don't have to forget. And you do need to forgive, and not for their sake, but for your own.
So, Lina, I've always heard, and I've in fact often heard, that you don't have to forget even when you forgive.
Absolutely. So, despite some people's perceptions that forgiveness means to forget, it is not.
Mhm.
But you
Okay.
don't have to keep the pain alive to keep the truth alive. There's a great poem in the journal by Mark Nepo that beautifully explains this. Also, you have to remember that forgiveness cannot be a transactional exchange.
Lovely. I totally agree with you, Lina. You don't have to keep the pain alive to keep the truth alive. What do you mean by transactional exchange?
So, it's just like where, one person says sorry and the other person says, I forgive you. Forgiving too easily can lock you into unhealthy patterns that can last for years. So, it's by only deciding to forgive, that decision is known as decisional forgiveness. But that doesn't properly address, the issue or the event. So, we avoid things we should actually confront. We bury things that should, in fact, be unearthed. And as we said, recovery starts with acceptance, accepting that you're angry, accepting that you're hurt, accepting that something traumatic has happened to you.
So, Lina, won't remembering that pain be relieving the hurt? Would it not be better to forget that it happened? In fact, I just remembered, Lina, we had a moonshot conversation with Laila Al Qadri, and I remember her words. What does not get resolved gets stored in our bodies. The issue gets sorted in the tissue. It gets stored in the tissue. And ignoring it and not dealing with it does not mean it goes away.
Absolutely. Forgiveness has you deal with the hatred, because it resides in your system. And then you let it go instead of allowing it to eat at you. And that's literally what it does. It eats it eats your healthy body. Now, we all know that there's a close link between negative emotions and illness. We've spoken about it often that toxic and destructive emotions have the potential to activate certain diseases if we don't attend to them. So, Vinita, this is for you more than the other person. Physicians record a variety of illnesses from as mild as a back problem to as intense as cancer that can show improvement as the patients learn to forgive. So, forgiveness from a greater perspective is more to do with your own emotional welfare. Forgiveness is not really for the other person's benefit at all, it is for our own. It's a choice to not sacrifice your future for a past, that you really can't change.
In fact, a lack of forgiveness, that is holding the anger, fear, pain, resentment, has a measurable impact on our bodies.
Yeah. Consciously and unconsciously, we all carry around so many life incidences and
Yes.
experiences, that create inner wounds, even from significant people in our lives, like our parents. We take the incidents and then we use the power of the story to change it from a limiting belief to an empowering belief. That's the power of forgiveness. What would happen if you believed that there are no accidents in the universe and that everything happening happens to teach you something? From a spiritual perspective, the ego feeds off fear and convinces us that we were wronged in some way. And what if we weren't? What if everything is, what if we were stoic enough to imagine that everything's happening for a reason? There's a Dr. Wayne Dyer whose teachings pull me through the most challenging time of my life. He said it so well. He said, you can be happy or you can be right, but you can't be both. Destructive emotions and peace and happiness don't actually coexist. So, you have to choose one or the other.
Absolutely agreed. Lina, Nainaz is asking a question: is letting go and forgiving the same?
Slight difference. We could do the power of letting go, but letting go, when you forgive, you do let go of negative emotions, etc., etc. Letting go can also become a much larger thing because we're so scared to let go of relationships, to let go of things, because we have certain emotional attachments to them. So slight difference, but yes, but when you forgive, you do have to let go of the emotional baggage you're carrying.
Lovely. So, Lina, I recall the moonshot conversations we did on brain waves and consciousness. Fear vibrates at a lower consciousness level in contrast to love, which registers at a much higher level. And so, the energy of love is capable of disentangling lower emotional states.
Absolutely. When I vibrated at a lower consciousness, I would take some actions that came from the wounded parts of me. And they were intended to cause pain to those I believe were wrong. Today, I've let go of that victim mentality or a need to be right. So today, I no longer make excuses for why I can't do something, that will help me grow, like exercise, or things that hold me back, like, allowing distractions. Forgiving yourself is the greatest action you can take to get out of your own way. um, you know, you free yourself of self-judgment because that's only going to keep you weighed down. Forgiving yourself is the absolute act of self-love, and it will absolutely move you forward in incredible ways. Remember when we spoke about empathy, we said you can have cognitive empathy or emotional empathy. You remember the difference between the two?
Absolutely, Lina. Absolutely. In fact, cognitive empathy is from mind to mind when we are able to get a mental state of how another person thinks. And emotional empathy is when you literally tune into the other person's feelings and is a lot more powerful.
So absolutely, and forgiveness also works on the cognitive or the emotional level. So on the cognitive level, you can let go of negative thoughts, bitterness, or the need for revenge. But what you want to aim for is forgiveness at the emotional level, because otherwise you've taken the decision to forgive with your head, but the pain and the hurt will only dissipate when you forgive with your heart. So only when you do this will you replace negative emotions like anger and resentment with positive emotions like empathy and love. There's a great way, and I've done it both with Anthony Robbins and John DeMartini. They do this. They do a process where they ask you to find benefit in what someone has done to hurt you.
Wow, finding benefit in what someone did to you. That's interesting. Can you please explain?
So they ask you to rewrite the story of the
Mhm.
transgression in a journal by writing to the person of how their
Uh-huh.
actions have already benefited you or may benefit you in the future.
Can you give us some examples of this, Lena?
So take, for example, if you had an alcoholic parent, right?
Okay.
You benefit, you could write to him and you write to him that you're benefiting, that knowing, who he is and what he's going through, that is not someone you want to be.
Mhm.
So overall, if you believe and trust that there's a universal order, then, you believe everything happens for your higher good.
So just like people can be more or less empathetic, Lena, and it is something that we can learn. How does learning of forgiveness work, and what makes you more or less likely to be forgiving?
So as always, you will learn from what you see your parents do, right? Rather than what they say. So I watched my dad's cousin be really unfair to my father in business and cheat him out of his share of property connected to the business. What I first observed is a father who walked away without bitterness. He left and he saw that experience as a reason to leave India and start afresh in Australia. Today, if he had to write a letter to my uncle, his cousin, he could do it in a way that he could tell him how that benefited him. I then watched my mom tend to that same cousin's wife, so her sister-in-law, when she was suffering from multiple sclerosis. And this is a sister-in-law who was actually quite nasty to my mom, but watching my mom care for her, that's real emotional forgiveness. You would never have known that those transgressions occurred. So our parents or my parents taught me to forgive by their actions.
So your father and mother pardon their actions?
So in forgiveness, there's no meting out of justice or pardoning someone's behavior. In positive psychology, if you sit to pardon behavior, that does not constitute forgiveness. It's seen as a sort of form of self-deception, which encourages your sense of victimhood, and gives you a sense of power. To go back to your question, some people are naturally more forgiving than others, also because of their personality differences and their beliefs, values, and attitudes. People with higher self-esteem and more humility are naturally more forgiving. Narcissism is linked to an unforgiving personality, as narcissistic people are low in empathy and very high in a sense of entitlement. One of the things that psychology studies is our relationships with our significant others while growing up also affects our ability to forgive. So our relationships with our parents and grandparents, and whether we've had secure or insecure attachments to them, affect our relationships, because more secure attachments when we're growing up helps us. When we're more secure, we're more likely, to be forgiving, especially in our adult romantic relationships. Studies show that, insecure individuals do not accommodate when a close partner hurts them, because they're less forgiving than securely attached individuals. So also they tend to ruminate about the relationship, to a point that any threat will activate the fear and the anger response and actually drive a partner further away.
In fact, we spoke about the danger of rumination when we spoke about the power of thought, Lena.
Yep. And thinking repetitive, unhelpful thoughts, we all know, the whole corroboree knows, is not helpful to anyone. And obviously, if your head is filled with repetitive thoughts of how someone hurt you, you have no space to reframe, and then therefore no space to, even start the process of forgiveness.
Great discussion on forgiveness, Lena. So forgiveness, like empathy, is a human skill worth pursuing for anyone who desires a greater sense of well-being. I love the reframing idea and creating new narratives, Lena, which I believe all of humanity should participate in. It's easy to see how humanity would benefit enormously if more of us cultivate forgiveness as a skill.
Absolutely. And, there are many laws in human history that have evolved out of, our need to regulate a natural human tendency towards revenge. And hopefully we as humanity will sort of revisit so many things, including, our prison systems as they are today. There are so many stories of courageous forgiveness, like Nelson Mandela, who said, courageous people do not fear forgiving for the sake of peace. Or, Mary Johnson, who hugged the man who murdered her only son. Or Georgia Farrell, who was mistakenly shot by a police officer and forgave him. If we all practice having a forgiving attitude, we have the chance to sort of hardwire forgiveness into the fabric of humanity. and lead us towards a more peaceful future.
Absolutely. Lina, we are out of time, but I do want you to tell us quickly about Hoponopono before we go.
So, Hoponopono is a Hawaiian system, and I taught it to my dad, that heals oneself and the world as well. So, more than 30 years ago in Hawaii, at the Hawaii State Hospital, there was a special ward, a clinic for the mentally ill criminals. These are people who had committed serious crimes, and they were assigned there either because they had a very deep mental disorder or because they needed to be checked to see if they were sane enough to stand trial. They'd committed, horrible crimes like murder, rape, kidnapping. Then one day, a newly appointed clinical psychologist, a guy by the name of Dr. Stanley Hugh Len, he comes to the ward. To cut a long story short, and when he finishes, he heals the prisoners. And at the end of his, healing, there are only a couple of inmates that get relocated, and this clinic actually has to close down because there's no people.
Wow. How did you do that, Lina?
So what he says is, he only tried to heal himself, applying an old traditional healing practice. He says that he was simply healing the part of himself that created the criminals. So simply put, Hoponopono is based on the knowledge that anything happens to you or anything that you perceive, the entire world where you live is your own creation. And thus it is entirely your responsibility, 100% your responsibility without exception.
But Lina, how can other criminals be his responsibility?
So it being his responsibility doesn't mean it's his fault. It means that you're responsible for healing yourself in order to heal whatever or whoever it is that appears to you as a problem. So whatever you call the world and perceive as the world is your world. It is the projection of your mind. So this process calls on your own divine intelligence. And these are the only things you have to say. So let's try Hoponopono. I love you. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. We'll just try it once again. Will you do it with me, AR?
Please go ahead.
Let's do it together.
Sure.
I love you.
I love you.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Please forgive me.
Please forgive me.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure the Korabri has done this with us as well at the same time.
So this practice is so powerful, and it's not only performed in Hawaii, but also on other islands throughout the South Pacific, including Samoa, Tahiti, and New Zealand.
Fantastic, Lina. So Hoponopono says that the world is your world and only you can take responsibility for it. Fascinating conversation, Lina. And once again, we are out of time, as always, for every Moonshot Conversations. So see you next week on Sunday at 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time. In fact, I look forward to practicing Hoponopono till we meet again. I have a great respect for the intelligence of the indigenous people of the world. Anything that can be an antidote to hate, conflict, violence, and crime. So, Lina, looking forward to the session on next Sunday also. And Korabri, thank you so much for always being with us online with your wonderful comments and questions.
Thank you. See you next Sunday.